Thank you. Thank you for the very warm welcome. Thank you, McGill and CIRMMT for bringing me here. In the introduction, it sounded like I know everything about everything. As a matter of fact, I feel I know very little about a lot of things, and that's as much an advantage as a disadvantage. We will see how I get around with that. When I was invited to speak here, I thought, what can I contribute? What is special, or what can I contribute which I know about? And I thought I should talk about abundance and limits and in music production these days. And I thought I should talk about it from the perspective of someone who is creating music, but I should also have a look at the perspective of someone who is involved with creating the tools. And so I decided that the title of my talk is Give Me Limits, Two Perspectives on computer-based music production in our time of exponentially growing possibilities. During the preparation of my talk, I figured out that that doesn't make sense because I have much more to say from the musician's perspective than from the software developer perspective. And I also felt that already talking about a musician's perspective somehow doesn't do the problem justice, because we are much more than musicians. So the actual title of this talk is Multiple Perspectives, multiple very fragmented perspectives, and we will see where this leads to. There is a very classical romantic idea about music making. This is the idea of the composer creating the score, and then you have the score and the player playing it with the instrument. And if it's a bit more fancy, then we have this fantastic scenario of the orchestra, and there's more people involved. There's the conductor, there's multiple players. And of course, there's the instrument builder, because, well, without instruments, nothing to play with for the player, apart from their voices, maybe. So this is a very established, very rich, but also very rigid way of thinking. And that's not even the whole scenario. There is more to it. There is the space. And there's some skilled people building spaces which sound great. And as we all know, the space is more than just a room with instruments. The space allows us to enjoy music because the instruments blend and it has acoustic properties which we like. And last not least, there's the audience. These are these round circles, that's the audience. And they interact, and that's an important part of it, because we play differently if the audience reacts differently. And so this is the scenario which we usually use to describe this idea of music. And then suddenly things happen which change everything. Tape and the invention of recording. And to me, this is by far the most important change of all of them, because with the invention of tape, we have the possibility to think about music in a radically different way than ever before. We can get rid of the instrument, we can get rid of the performer, and we can invent things like musique concrète, which is the mother of everything we do with computers. Because, well, we can sample every sound source, we can use everything as material, we can cut it in slices, we can transpose it, we can filter it, we can duplicate it. We can do pretty much everything with tape, what we can imagine with software. There's obvious limitations, but from a pure philosophical perspective, tape and scissors is everything we need. And this, of course, radically changes the performance practice and the compositional practice. We have the composer interacting with the tape, and let me use the tape here as a placeholder for, of course, tape plus studio plus mixing desk plus loudspeakers, etc., etc. But what we don't have anymore is the instrument. And what we don't have anymore is the score. The only way to express music made for tape is the tape. The tape is the score. There's no separation anymore. There's no room for interpretation anymore, apart perhaps in the way we play it back. But the composition is ingrained in the tape. And the most significant other property is, if we think about the fact that we can use any sound as source, that of course everything becomes music and everything becomes material. And already with the invention of tape, we completely lose this idea of this is natural sound versus this is artificial. This whole discussion about electronic music being artificial and real music being real music. If you record a piano, you can still argue that you're hearing a piano and you're just hearing a proper piano performance. What happens if you record a one-bar loop from a piano and loop it infinitely? Are you still hearing a piano, or do you hear electronic music? Well, it's a piano loop. Okay, so let's loop one single note. Bing, 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 bing. That's clearly not a piano anymore, because it's the most artificial thing you can imagine. No piano player ever can play a piano like that. And so we are entering already a scenario where pretty much everything we assumed about music in this case is questionable and can be rethought. We can also nowadays rethink the role of the room. I added the room here because in my personal practice and in my personal interest, sound diffusion and the room play such an important role. And I placed a lot of audience here. I was very optimistic about the audience for a tape concert. And also, we have a different interaction here, which is also interesting when it comes to performance practice. Since there's no conductor necessary anymore, the big issue with tape concerts always were that people felt kind of odd with the fact that someone is pressing play and that's all you get presented. And this is a notion which is true till today, when all these discussions are, what are these people with their laptops doing on stage? Are they doing anything at all? This discussion is as old as tape music. So, before I come to the core of what I like to tell, I want to provide you with a bit of a background, which I find essential so that you can evaluate my perspective. My background is, in some ways, in very unacademic music. As a proper person living as a young guy in Berlin in the early 1990s, I got severely influenced by electronic club music. And of course, I started making electronic club music together with a good friend of mine. And I like to give you an idea about our studio, because that's our instrument. And our studio in the mid-90s pretty much looked like that. So we had a Max patch, which we used for sequencing, because we both, and this is also important, are not trained musicians. Gerhard Belis and me both come from a background of people who have a technological background, but not a musical background. So we were forced to perceive music and to perceive the idea of musical creation from a very different perspective. We couldn't play. So a sequencer, for instance, which as a necessity requires that I play something and record it, wouldn't be of interest for us because we wouldn't know what to do with it because we can't play. So we basically built a sequencer which we could conduct. So we always saw us as conductors. And we were using, well, hardware, a limited set of machines which we could afford, and a mixing desk and some reverbs. And we recorded this to a two-track tape recorder. And the process of creating was a process of performing the studio. We liked this idea to treat the studio as the instrument, but also as the score. And we're basically operators. So we were operating this in real time. And by operating this in real time, we create a certain flow of events and basically an endless session. Very, very typical for a lot of 1970s electronic music concerts. The main difference was that it was always clear for us that what we are creating is material. So what we end up is, let's say, a 1-hour improvisation, which involves a lot of slow changes due to the nature of what we did there on tape. And this is raw material. And this raw material has some great moments and a lot of mediocre moments and a few really bad ones. Very interesting observation. It was so true that it's really fascinating. Always when we stopped the tape, because we thought now we have said everything and it's getting boring, in I would say 90% of the cases, this was the most interesting part of everything. And I don't know why this is the case, but I found it remarkable that at the moment where you think you have nothing to say anymore, you very often tend to reach the perfect scenario where you actually should continue. But I have no idea why this is the case. So we have raw material, and then we used basically a very early version of Pro Tools to edit this together into something meaningful. And by copying, by doing all kinds of things, basically tape manipulation. And this, of course, led to results which you couldn't play. And in the good examples, this led to results which we really liked. And it's important to understand this because it also is a process. It's a process of separated tasks, and I come back to this because retrospectively this was a good process. At some point a music software emerged where some of our ideas were ingrained simply due to the fact because we made it. So this is a very early version of Ableton Live, and it was meant to solve a problem. It was meant to solve the problem that we didn't find a good existing software solution for performance. And our musical mind was so much driven by this idea of performance, of being able to use the computer as a partner you can play with instead of a tape recorder. And at the beginning, this was very limited. We had no MIDI. We could only play back a few audio tracks. And by the limited capacities of computers, we were forced to use maybe 6 tracks maximum and maybe 2 effect change. So that was by no means unlimited possibilities. This was very limited. And in order to make something useful with this piece of software, you had to have other ways to actually obtain material. So you had to use other instruments to create something first, which you then could use in the software. Well, Moore's law helped us a lot. And 10 years later, we have a very different situation which slowly emerged. And this is a situation where on this very computer here, I can do everything I want and much more. And it's very rare that I hit a CPU limit. And if I hit a CPU limit, I have many ways of overcoming it. So suddenly, from a situation of having to make compromises, we're ending up with a situation where a lot of things are possible. And I forgot one thing, so I need to go back here. This method had one problem which really bothered us a lot. And this problem was that very often we had a moment which was great. Let's assume this blue moment here is great. But there was one element in there which we didn't like. And you know, this hi-hat running, and afterwards we noticed that it's actually not perfectly in sync. And there's no way to remove it because it's a stereo recording. So one of the things we put in this software was one of the very, very essential early concepts was that we play a session like this one, and we record a session protocol. We called it like this, a session protocol. So the idea was that you play with that, and you record, well, the protocol, which is then the arrangement, and then you have the ability to actually remove the things you don't like and make corrections. But the suggested workflow was first you play, and then you do the editing, but you do it with more options than you would have with Pro Tools at this time. So that was one of the core reasons why the software is how it is, like why the software is how it is, yeah. So nowadays, with the addition of MIDI to this thing, which was the most important step towards making this thing being a tool of abundance amongst a lot of other tools, is as soon as there's MIDI in there, there's no need anymore to look for external sources. It becomes a closed system. You can just use this single program, and you can do a lot of things with it from within itself. And at some later point in time, there was the addition of Max for Life, which allowed even more fine-grained access. And it doesn't only allow more fine-grained access, it allows also a very different mode of thinking about music and about sound creation. And this is, you suddenly open the door to coding. And basically, this is a door opening to hell, because it's very effective to get lost in there. And most users actually of Max for Life don't go that route. And I think they're right, because we will see that this is not in every case the best possible thing to do, but it is possible. So in a way, we have this scenario here somehow rebuilt in software. But it's not true, because this scenario here is a scenario with very separated tasks for different people. And no one expects that the instrument builder is the perfect conductor and the most genius composer. And no one expects that the player has profound knowledge about room acoustics and so on and so on. It's also a process where time plays an important role in such a way that not everything here is real time, and not everything happens at the same time. The instrument is very static. The composition is happening with a different mindset than the performance. And as soon as we enter the computer, everything of this can happen at any time. And so we're dealing with two different mindsets. The mindset of the composer, who is interested in extension of possibilities, and who says, it would be great if I have a different instrument. It would be great if my orchestra could have a different sonic palette. And we have the instrument builder and the performer, who is aiming for, well, the performer is aiming for stability. The performer wants something they can practice. The performer wants something they can master. And you can only master something which is stable, which doesn't change while you're playing it. And these are two different mindsets. But if all of those two things are in the same software, available at the same time, you have to somehow merge those two mindsets into one person, which is the person in front of the computer. And as a matter of fact, you find arguments for exactly the different mindset. The composer needs actually stability, because you can't compose if you don't know the instrument. You need to have an idea about what the instrument's constraints are. And the player, of course, at some point thinks it would be nice if my instrument could react differently to how I'm playing. And unfortunately, all of those things are possible these days, and they're just one mouse click away. And this leads me to this slide here. This slide is, in a way, the classical image of the problem we are facing now. The problem is that we can easily add more and more tools. A lot of tools are for free. Even the tools which are not for free are very inexpensive in comparison to buying a lot of hardware. And even if we don't add any tools, just by the fact that computers are getting faster, we can multiply what we already have. Because if we have a software, and this software 10 years ago was able to play back 6 channels, it now plays back on the same computer 60, 80, 100 channels. So we have suddenly much more possibilities without doing anything apart from following the usual upgrade circle of hardware. And so we have this blue curve here. This blue curve is what I label with the total cost of ownership. What I mean with this is the more things you have, the more time you need to learn them, the more time you need to maintain them, the more time you need to find them, which is, for instance, a very classical scenario with tons of sound libraries. It's very easy to have access to hundreds or thousands of presets, but are you using them? Are you actually aware of the presets you have on your computer? Do you know what kind of richness comes with your software? And actually, the more you have of those, the less likely is that you are using them, because you're getting lost. And then you end up using the things which you always use because you know them. So perhaps actually that's already a sign where too much doesn't lead to a better output. And then there's inspiration. It is very clear that new tools are fueling inspiration. And this is especially true for electronic arts. It has been true since the very invention of tools. Something new comes and everyone is excited about the possibilities, and this creates ideas, and the ideas create demands for tools. We're coming back to this. If you already have hundreds of tools, a new tool is very unlikely to add anything substantial apart from more workload, apart from more bureaucracy and all these things. So it is very clear that there is some point where adding new possibilities is not only not helping the creative process, but actually is working against the creative process. The big problem is how to define this spot there, where is this spot? Because it's nothing which can be measured, and it's very personal, and it depends on your artistic ideas, it depends on many, many factors. And it's probably very hard to find an agreement about this point, even amongst your best friends. But one observation I believe is very true, that there is a point where you have too much, where you have too many possibilities. And one observation I make very often is the music and not only the music, but it's most obvious, the music I admire most is to a large extent made by people with a very limited setup in some way. And this brings me to the core of the talk, this give me limits. The question is, who defines which limits make sense? Because limits are, of course, also scary. Every time you limit yourself, you think maybe you're losing something very important on the other side of the fence. Maybe my art would be much better if I had that or that or that. And to constrain yourself and say, well, no, my art is better without this, it takes quite some, I'm missing the correct word here, but you need to be brave. So the question which is inherent in this whole debate is if we can perceive computer music or electronic music, or however we want to label it these days, from the development of instruments. Like the question, do we need new instruments? Or is it sufficient what we have already? And for obviously the complete history of electronic music, the answer was very simple. Yes, we need new instruments. Think about the DX7 as a great example. The DX7 allowed people outside the academic world to create stable, complex, inharmonic timbres. This was just not possible without digital synthesis. So when you were interested in using the timbres, let's say, which you heard in a piece from John Chowning, and you wonder, wow, how can I make this amazing percussion sounds? The answer was, well, the DX7. It was not possible before. And therefore, it was not a question that if you are interested in a certain specific sonic aesthetic, you had to buy this piece of equipment. And the same goes for a lot of other equipment. Think about sampling, think about convolution reverbs, think about Melodyne, think about whatever of the last few years you found inspiring and amazing. So if you would say, I don't need all this stuff, then you would miss out on something which is very important. The interesting question to me is, in the year 2015, how much is this concept still valid? And I personally come to the conclusion that we reached a point where potentially we have saturation, and we need to come to different conclusions. And this brings me to the perspective of how to deal with that as a software developer. And I try to provide answers. The usual interaction between instrument designers and composers has always been this kind of mutual feedback. There's an instrument, and the instrument provides inspiration. The inspiration leads to a work. The work can be evaluated, and you say, well, if I had this and this property in the instrument, I could probably do a different work. Then the next generation of instruments takes this into account, and so on and so on. So we always have this nice coevolution of instruments, music practice, results. And this is so obvious if you just listen to electronic music, both on the academic side and on the popular side, over the last 50 years. And you very clearly can say, okay, this is the piece which has been made possible, for instance, by FM synthesis. This is the piece of popular music which clearly explores sampling. This is what we only can do because we have time stretching, and so on and so on. And there's always this coevolution. But now we have a situation where, at least I personally, and that's as much as I can contribute to this specific point, is my personal opinion, I personally don't feel the need of new instruments. I actually feel that I'm beyond this climax point. In fact, I just recently bought an instrument, and I think it's one instrument too much. It doesn't add anything new to my sonic palette. It just adds distraction. And I should actually get rid of it. And this brings me to this point here. Devaluation by abundance. What I mean with this is that if you have a limited instrument, but this instrument has some inherent beauty, you are very likely to try to master it and explore it, and you create a personal relationship to it. Some of the instruments I like most in my studio are very limited, very outdated machines, but I can feel the personality of the creator in there, and I have this relationship with those instruments which I would call creative friction. There is things these instruments offer which are immediately convincing sonically, and at the same time, there's properties of these instruments which make it clear that I can't do everything with them. I have to accept their personality. And this, in a way, is fantastic because it forces me to really rethink my artistic practice and think, what is it, what I can do with this instrument? And the result of this very focused occupation of this instrument very often leads to very pleasing results. The problem is, or not the problem, on the other side, I have a lot of plugins on my computer, as pretty much everyone, because, well, every piece of software these days comes with tons of plugins. I have a hard time actually even approaching them because it's just another plugin. I don't take them serious because there's so much of them. And I don't even spend the time to evaluate if one of those plugins might be amazing because I don't see them anymore. It's too much, and they all have the same prominence. The very important ones feel and look the same as the very unimportant ones. It just became this blurry mess of possibilities. Whilst in my studio with my hardware, I make a decision, a very logical, not logical, I'm missing the word again, a very deliberate decision to say, okay, this is big, but it does a good job. It can stay at the central position. I assign a value to it, and then I work around it. And this is not good, so it needs to go. In my computer, all these things are there at the same level. And I believe that this is a core of the problem, that we have this very same level of prominence of things which are very important to us in our working practice, and of things which are actually not at all important for our practice. And we ourselves need to define a topology of what is important for us. And this leads me to this question that if everything is possible now, first of all, is this really the case? And second, if everything is possible, how do we deal with that? And I came to the conclusion during the preparation of this talk that the key to this is what I like to call the topology of effort. Because if you look again at this tool as an example for a tool which is very, very widely used and which on the surface allows you to do pretty much everything, this tool obviously has is a structure. It represents a thinking. It represents the thinking of Gerhard and me and a few other people who were involved in the very original design. It is basically a model of how a musical composition and performance process can be organized. It has many, many possibilities. There's many things you can do with that. And in fact, I believe there's almost nothing you can't do with it. But it's also very clear that certain possibilities are very easy and other possibilities are very hard. And that's a property every instrument has. It's very easy with a guitar to play a nice chord progression. The guitar is made for this. It's very easy to play drums with a drum kit. So every instrument has properties which make it clear what's the use case. But also you can use instruments in many, many ways. And with electronic instruments, even more than ever. Even interesting. Anyway, next slide. So if you look at, for instance, Ableton Live, and it's just a placeholder because we can talk about any piece of software here and we come to similar conclusions. We have a setup, and this setup is a technical structure, and this technical structure is variable, obviously. We can define how many tracks we want. We can define which audio effects we want to use. We can define which kind of synthesis we want to use. We can transform MIDI messages. We have return tracks. We can route things. We can even turn audio into MIDI by doing some analysis, which very often works surprisingly well. We can re-record audio. We can basically do a lot of things. And this even without the addition of Max and Max for Live. So, and of course we can layer a lot of those things, which means we have a lot of possibilities. But, and much more possibilities than in the hardware studio because of the fact that it's so modular. In the hardware studio, you have one compressor. If you want two compressors, well, you buy a second one. You certainly don't buy 20 unless you have a lot of money. Throw in 50 compressors in this computer. It's duplicate, 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 and you're done. And actually, a lot of people use, in my opinion, way too many of those. But if you go one step further, or step actually a little bit further away, and you think about the effort again, then it is clear that not everything is equally possible. So I try to be really negative towards this piece of software and say, okay, we have only a stereo output. If you want to do multiple channels, you are suffering because you have to find your ways around that. It's not impossible, but it's not something the software just offers you on a plate. You have synthesizers, and they have a specific palette and a specific color and a specific user interface. If you want something else, you need to choose a different synthesizer. But it's not a modular system in some way. The same is true for audio effects. They're closed boxes. They offer one view on how a compressor, EQ, whatever looks like. But these things, we can argue we have so many varieties that it's not a big problem. There's a few things which are much more problematic in a way. It's based on MIDI notes. The whole MIDI sequencing is based on MIDI notes. MIDI notes are a very Western, very 18th, 19th century way of thinking. It's equal tempered. It's 12 notes per octave. It's notes in the first place, with a note on and a velocity and a note off. What is the meaning of a note on playing back a sample loop? What is the meaning of a note on playing back a granular cloud of statistic things? It's no meaning at all, but it's a necessary placeholder to trigger an instrument. And this means there is something coded in there which offers a certain way of thinking which might not be your thinking. And therefore, even if the possibilities of sound creation are very wide, we still have to deal with a certain topology of thinking there. And it's also clear that pretty much every tool we use, every musical instrument, every piece of software, every piece of hardware, in one way or the other has this kind of thinking. Because if not, then you would end up with an empty piece of paper or an empty piece of memory where you have to code everything. And then everything is possible, but the time you need to code everything is infinite, and the result is 0. So at some point, we have to accept that there's a topology of existing things. But we need to be aware of that. And I believe, to switch now to the software manufacturer position here, the biggest challenge for the future is to find better ways to navigate through these topologies, find better ways to open our tools in such a way that we can do things beyond those limitations without the instruments becoming arbitrary. Because the classical idea, let's add another feature, is exactly what doesn't lead to anything anymore. Because the more features we add, we end up with something which is kind of noise. The noise of endless possibilities. We actually like reduction. We like to have focus. But at the same time, we like to have focus which is defined by ourselves. And this is where, as a matter of fact, for instance, for me, coding becomes important. We are a generation of people who are much more computer savvy than any generation before us, because computers are the things we grew up with. And coding even is something which is very normal to us. HTML, sure. JavaScript, yeah, why not? Etc., etc. So coding becomes a part of a musical practice, potentially. It's at least not completely out of reach. And this brings us in a position where we can actually create whatever we like. But the big question is, if you think about the result, when does it make sense to code something? And in my personal experience, the biggest problem with coding is coding takes a lot of time. And so you spend some time to code something because you have a musical idea, and you switch from your musical mind to the computer science mind. And this is a process which takes much more time and is the opposite of being spontaneous and coming up with a great musical theme. So you start coding. And then you do a little bit of composition afterwards. And that's not very healthy and actually quite frustrating. And you do it once, and at some point you think, okay, that's not my thing. But if you manage to find something that supports your musical practice in a very meaningful way, and you code it once, and you develop a lot of pieces with that, things look very different. And suddenly this is extremely empowering, and you can do things which are potentially very simple, and potentially very powerful and very personal. And this is what I find really remarkable, that we are now in a position where we actually can shape our musical practice by defining our own topology of instruments, by defining our own path through this. But it needs to have a different mindset. And what we talk here is, we talk about time. And I'd like to, effort and time. And I'd like to move on here to something which bothers me a lot. All the music creation we have these days, mostly, well, I have to say, is timeline-based at one point. We start editing things on a timeline. And what happens here is we're listening to our music, and it doesn't have, it's not no effort anymore. Repeating our own music is effortless. It's just pressing play. And it was very different if you think about actually playing. When you play your own piece, it's an active act of playing and performing it. If you just hit play on the play bar, you don't need to do anything anymore. Things get even more complicated if you loop things. There's this one piece here, this section here, we need to change it. Something is wrong there. We play a loop, and we repeat this loop forever and make little changes until we are satisfied. And what happens in this process is we create a lot of musical material. Basically, every single loop iteration where we change something, we create. But we only keep the end result, and we discard everything we did in between. And we spend a lot of time tweaking this little loop with completely ignorance of everything around. And then we're listening to the whole piece again. We figure out that we got completely lost in a small detail. And on top of that, we can jump. We completely ignore the large picture. We are in one small section, then we jump to another small section. And it is very, very hard to keep a consistent result. And on top of that, we all see this in a graphical interface, which keeps us informations which are based by visual appearance. And on top of that, we not only can change the sound, we can at any time change the instrument or start even coding. So we have a lot of situations here where we can go deeper and deeper and deeper into detail and get completely lost. And at some point we notice that all our efforts of the last few days basically led to a completely fragmented and inconsistent non-composition. And as a result of that, we clean up. And we clean up visually, because it's hard to hear to all this stuff, because we have been listening to it for hours, thanks to the looping. We listen to our material till we can't hear it anymore. So what do we do as an aid? Well, we know about musical structures. Okay, it's a dance piece. So 8 bars, 8 bars, 8 bars, 8 bars. Oh, that's 7 bars and a half. Wrong, 8 bars. We don't listen to it, we just do it, because we have experience. And guess what? We end up with this formalized music we all become to dislike at some point. And this has to do with, in a way, also with the abundance. If we had less abundance, we wouldn't be less tired about what we're hearing, because this process here wouldn't exist that much. We would come very much where we would achieve results quicker with less thinking, because we have less options. And therefore, the big deal these days is how to reduce options. And this brings me, time runs fast, wow. This brings me to a topic which is related. Everyone these days is raving about modular synthesizers, and I have to admit I'm kind of infiltrated by this too. Don't start. If you didn't start yet, don't. By any meaningful thinking, this shouldn't be the case anymore. These things, you can't store anything. They are completely difficult to tune. If what comes out you can call tuned in any way. Nothing can be reproduced, you can't store it. It's a big mess. If you look at all these patch codes, I mean, you can probably create something like this, but if you go having your dinner and you come back and try to understand what you have done, no chance. So this seems to be completely outdated. But as a matter of fact, working with those systems is, for many reasons, very, very intriguing, especially as a counterpoint to the perfect computer scenario. Because this one here means you make a decision now, at this very moment. And you either accept that this decision is happening now and will be gone, or you record it and say, this is it. This enforces decisions. This enforces reduction. This enforces to see this as my instrument and nothing else. And you either get something out of this instrument or you don't. But this doesn't tell you this is something which I can augment later, or this is something which is not finished. It always says, I am finished. I am finished in this very moment. And it's a separation of process. And this is something which actually becomes a value when everything is possible. So what you can learn from this is that perhaps as a practice of dealing with computer sound is you have to enforce yourself some personal limits, some limits which you impose in your work. And the question is, do you use these limits on a piece-to-piece basis, or do you use these limits as your general compositional practice? Or is there anything in between? And what I do these days is actually I try to limit my options on a piece-to-piece basis. I think, what is it I want to achieve? What is the instruments and necessities I have to do this? And then I try to stick with that. So I build my own mental landscape. And whenever I add, for instance, too many tracks, I'm getting skeptical. Because I think if I cannot express myself with, let's say, 15 tracks, then probably I can't express myself with 30 tracks. So I try to ignore the endless possibilities by superimposing a very artificial limit in the hope that this limit keeps me on track. And part of this limit is actually deadlines in a funny way. That's a a slight detour from the topic, but I figured that deadlines help dealing with abundance in this case, because deadlines enforce that you are doing something which is informed by the core of your work. If you have a deadline, you can't think of coding anymore. You just use what you have. If you think of deadlines, you don't think about maybe a different sound for this instrument make things better. No, this sound either works or it doesn't. And I feel that this helps a lot. To come to a conclusion here towards the end of this talk, I like to throw something else in this big mess of thoughts, and this has to do with feedback. And with feedback, I mean actually the production process. If you think about the very beginning of the scenario of having the composer and the conductor and the instrumentalists, you have a scenario with separated work, separate labor. And you have a scenario which naturally involves communication and interpretation. And your conductor probably will tell you or will conduct your piece a little bit different than you envisioned. And you learn from that. And maybe you have a discussion with him or her. The performers will perform the piece slightly different, informed by what they think is a good practice. And you will have discussions. And there's time in between, time to think. You go home after rehearsal and you think, was it good? And computers make all this disappear into, this is me, the composer, architect, conductor, whatever. And there is one thing which actually works in favor of us here. And this is the fact that we have a new type of feedback which we have to, which I think we can embrace. And this is the fact that we can publish our music extremely fast. So not only can we produce extremely fast, one way of getting feedback equally fast is, and this is what I believe is happening amongst the younger people doing stuff, they do something fast, and they publish it fast, and they get feedback fast, and they modify. And in a way, I find this a very interesting new way of thinking. So instead of finding the problem that everything is this gigantic abundance, we can use the abundance of possibilities to actually work in favor of us by using a potentially infinite audience out there to see what feedback we can get. And that's something which, I believe, in some way counteracts one of the problems. Yes, we work alone mostly, and we are in this closed loop of our own system, and we don't know how to evaluate our work. But we have this fantastic resource of a nearly infinite audience there and can test at every stage if it works. And I know about a lot of artists who are embracing this as a working method. Just throw out sketches and see how people react to sketches. And if people react well to a sketch, continue working on it based on the feedback. That's a kind of interesting loop. Towards the end, and before I go into discussion mode, I like to be a little bit provocative, and I say, computer music is dead. And what I mean with this is that I believe we reached a point where we can start decoupling our musical ideas from the notion of the computer, because the computer as an entity is on its way out. Already we only have laptops and no desktops anymore. Already we have a generation of people who think the mouse is a strange sideway because you can click with the finger on the screen. And we have a generation of people who embraces modular synthesis because it's not a computer and it's not a screen and it's nothing I do my email with. Potentially, I feel that the future of electronic music is that the electronic and the computer becomes less and less significant, and that by the fact that we have reached a point where synthesis-wise and structure-wise a lot of questions are answered, that we can actually, and this is the positive aspect of it, come back to a conclusion that what we are interested in is music. And the fact that it's computer-generated is, for the outside world, as unimportant as anything else. The result counts. And it's not computer music anymore because it's our personal version of a small segment of it. And this is my idea of dealing with abundance. We take a small segment of all the possibilities and we build our own subset of this. We say, this is what we are interested in artistically. And then we have a look at the available options, and we decide which of all these millions of options are the one which serve our artistic purposes best. And we take our subset of all these options, and we live within this subset. And that's not a limitation anymore, because we know that we can escape from this subset anytime. It's just a thought process, a construction, a mental construction, which allows us to navigate within these endless possibilities. And so that's my way of thinking about these abundances. And to end this with a perspective from a hardware or software manufacturer, the one thing we notice is that people are obviously tired of universal machines. This is beyond. We are in a post-computer generation. People like hardware because it's limited and it's focused. And people are not interested anymore in something which has millions of options. People are interested in general in something which has a clear, defined scope. And so I see two possible future pathways for development. The one possible pathway is that we need to find a better way to navigate through these topologies. That if we want to work in multiple channels, or in alternative tunings, or with alternative ideas about how we construct music, that we need tools for that. And that the tools need to be flexible in such a way that these things are easier to approach than they are now. So we're not talking about something new, but we talk about a different access to something we already know. And the other thing is that we need things which are much less to do with bookkeeping. And I feel that these two areas are the ones where we can expect the most amazing things to happen. And I guess that's pretty much what I have to contribute here. And I'm very happy to open a discussion. Thank you.